Welcome to the next lesson in this course where we are going to implement user registration with Keycloak. This is what the user registration flow will look like once we implement it. The user is going to send a request to register to the Evently API application. Then the Evently API is going to authenticate with Keycloak using the client credentials flow and the confidential client that we created in the previous lesson. Keycloak is going to give us an access token, and then we will be able to call the register endpoint to register a user with Keycloak. If the user is successfully registered, we will get back a 201 created response as well as some information about the newly created user, and finally we can return a response to the user that they are now registered with the Evently system. I'm going to show you a very robust way of how we can implement this, and of course we are going to handle any errors gracefully. For example, an attempt to register with our system using an existing email address. So in this lesson, we will be focusing most of our effort on the users module because this is where we are storing the user information inside of the respective schema for this module. The use case for registering a new user starts from the register user endpoint. It's going to create a respective command, and then this command should return the identifier of the newly created user. You can see that this allows anonymous access, so anyone will be able to register with our system. I'm going to close this down, and we will start from the application layer, or to be more precise, the register user command handler, which is our actual use case. To interact with Keycloak, we can introduce an abstraction. So I'm going to create a folder here called identity. Inside of this folder, we will add anything that's related to our external identity provider. I'm choosing to use generic naming so that we aren't bound to any implementation details, such as the fact that we are using Keycloak. Now let me define an interface inside that I will call the iIdentityProvider service. What I want to achieve with this service is to send a post request to the respective endpoint on the Keycloak API and try to register a user. So because this can fail, I'm going to use a result object to express the fact that this can either succeed or fail, and we're going to return a string representing the identifier of the newly registered user in the Keycloak realm. If you recall from the previous lesson where we were setting up Keycloak, I mentioned that we would be connecting the Keycloak user ID with the user identifier inside of our database. Let's call this method register user async, and we would need to provide the email, first name, last name, and the password of the user to register them with Keycloak. Now I'm going to express this with a record that I'm going to use for my method. So let's call this the user model, and I'm going to include a few properties: the email, the password, the user's first name and last name. The user model will be an argument for this method, so let's call this the user, and I'm going to specify an optional cancellation token with a default value. And another thing that I'm going to add is an identity provider's error static class that's going to contain just one error object inside, specifying that the provided email is not unique. You can grab this type from the code snippet under this video. Now I'm going to move these types into their own files, and let's go back to our register user command handler. We're going to inject the iIdentityProvider service and call Keycloak to obtain a new identity ID. So I'm going to add this as a dependency, and then this will be the first thing that we do inside of the handle method. I'm creating a result string object that's going to come from calling our identity provider service. So let's create a new user model, and we already have the required values to pass to this type. So we are specifying the email, password, first name, and last name, as well as the cancellation token. If the result is a failure result, then I can say return result failure, and then I can return the error that is returned from the register user async method, which is going to come from the identity provider errors that I just defined. The next thing we need to do is to pass the value of this result, which is going to be the identity ID, as another argument to the user create method. Right now, this argument doesn't exist. So if we go to the user create method, let's introduce an identity ID argument. And of course, we will need to assign this to a respective property on the user entity. So let's create an identity ID property, and we are going to assign the value that is passed in as an argument to the identity ID property. So what this will do is attempt to register the user with Keycloak. If the registration succeeds, we're going to set the identity ID on the user object and then persist that inside of the database. Remember that we should also configure this with our EF core model. So inside of the user configuration class, that's inside of the infrastructure project, I'm going to add another line of code here to configure a unique index on the identity ID column, because this value has to be unique in our database anyhow, as it represents the unique ID inside of the Keycloak database. And another benefit is that it will improve performance when querying the users table and specifying the identity ID in the where statement, because the query will be able to utilize this index to seek to the respective row in the database. We will also need to create a respective database migration to add this column to the database, but I'm going to assume that you know how to do this, and I will omit this step. So let's close this down and let's go back to our use case. The next thing we need to do is to actually implement our identity provider service. So let's move over into the infrastructure project and create a new folder inside that's going to hold the implementation. I will call this the identity folder, and let's add a new class inside that's going to be called the identity provider service. Let's make this type internal and sealed, and it's going to implement the identity provider service interface. What we want to do inside of this method is send a post request to our Keycloak admin API, and the route is going to be the base address of our Keycloak instance, and then admin realms, the name of our realm, which is going to be Evently, and then the user's resource. We also need to send the expected request body in order to create a new user. You can find all of the details about the Keycloak RESTful API in their documentation. I'm just going to walk you through the post endpoint that I just mentioned, which creates a new user, and the username specified must be unique. The required arguments are the realm inside of the route and the user representation object in the request body. You can check out the documentation of what the user representation object should hold, and I'm going to introduce a C# type in our backend code to represent this resource. So I'm going to add the user representation type and the credential representation that we will use to set the user's password when calling the Keycloak API. You can of course find the code for these types from the code snippet under this video, as I'm introducing this code a bit faster to save us some time. You can see that the user representation contains a username, an email, a first name, last name, if the email is verified or not, if the user should be enabled or not, and then a credential representation model representing the credential type, the value, and if this credential is temporary or not. We're going to use this to create a new user representation instance. So let's create a new user representation object, and let's start passing in the required properties. I'm going to use the email from the user model as the username in this request, and I will specify the same value for the email. Then we have the first name and the last name of our user. I'm going to set email verified to true so that we don't have to go through this step, but in reality you may want to set this to false to force the user to verify their email. I'm also going to set enable to true so that we can immediately log in once we register with Keycloak, and then I need to pass in an array of credential representation instances, but I'm actually going to just provide one value. The name of the type that we want is password. However, I'm going to create a constant that's going to represent this. So let's create a private const string called password credential type, and let's assign the value of password. Then I'm going to use it when creating a credential representation model. I'm going to specify the user password from the user model, and I'm going to set temporary to false so that I don't have to set a new password once I authenticate with Keycloak. And then we actually have to call the Keycloak RESTful API. And for this, I'm going to introduce a typed client that's going to be configured to call our Keycloak API. And I'm going to add this class behind the scenes, and you can grab the source code for this type under this video. Let me walk you through what we have inside of the Keycloak client. I said that this is a typed client, which means that this is actually an HTTP client with a configured client instance that we can inject through the constructor. I'm going to expose just one method, register user async, accepting a user representation instance as the argument. We are going to use this to send a post request to the user's resource, which is going to be the endpoint on the Keycloak RESTful API, and we will specify the user representation. It's going to be serialized as JSON, and when we get a response back, let's ensure that this is a successful response. If it is, we can go ahead and try to extract the identity ID of the user from the location header. This is handled in this small helper method below, and if you aren't familiar with RESTful conventions, the location header should be returned from any endpoint creating a new resource, and it should contain a fully qualified URI where you can obtain the instance that you just created. So I'm using this fact to parse the identity ID from the location header. I'm accessing the location header using the HTTP response, headers, and then the location property, and we extract the path and query. If the location header is null for some reason, we're going to throw an exception. Otherwise, we can find the index of where the user's segment begins, and then from that segment, take a substring, which is going to be our identity ID value. You can take it at face value that this just works, but I'm also going to show you that this is the case when we demonstrate user registration. We're going to use the Keycloak client to implement our identity provider service. So let's go ahead and inject the Keycloak client as a dependency, and I'm going to give this a name of Keycloak client. I'm also going to inject an iLogger and specify identity provider service as the generic argument because I want to write a try-catch statement here, and here's what we are going to do. In the try step, I'm going to use the Keycloak client to send a post request to the Keycloak RESTful API. We can pass in the user representation model that we just created and the cancellation token. Of course, this method should be asynchronous so that we can await this call. And if this succeeds, let's just return the identity ID from the register user async method. Otherwise, if this throws an exception, let's write an error log using the logger. So I'm going to say log error. Let's pass in the exception and let's write a message saying user registration failed. One more thing I'm going to do is return a failure result from this method. So I will say result failure of string, and I will specify the identity provider errors. Email is not unique. Now, how am I going to know that this is the actual error that caused the exception and not anything else? Well, C# has a very interesting feature called the catch when statement, which you can use to filter on the exception that you just caught. In order to make this work, I need to specify a more concrete exception type, and this is going to be an HTTP request exception. And then in the when statement, I can say exception status code equals conflict. So conflict, or the 409 status code, is what is returned when there is an existing resource and we are trying to create another one on top. I'm confident that this will only happen if there is a registered user with this email, which is why I'm returning this error. And this wraps up the implementation of the identity provider service. Now let me move the user representation into its own file, as well as the credential representation type, and I will close all of this down. Now, one more thing that we do need is a way to authenticate with the Keycloak RESTful API, which I explained at the start of this lesson when I was walking you through the registration flow. And I'm going to introduce two more types into our code so that we can implement this, and this will be the Keycloak options class and the Keycloak authentication delegating handler. Let's take a look at the delegating handler, and of course you can grab the source code for both of these files from under this video. Now back to the delegating handler. A delegating handler is a way for us to wrap an outgoing HTTP request to an external service. It's a very similar concept to middleware, except middleware applies to incoming requests into our API, whereas delegating handlers are for outgoing requests. So what's going on here? I'm injecting an iOptions instance containing my Keycloak options. So let me show you what we have inside. We have a URL pointing to the base address of the Keycloak admin RESTful API. Then we have a URL to obtain an access token, the confidential client ID and confidential client secret, which we obtain from our Keycloak Realm configuration. And there is also the public client ID, which is going to be useful when we are implementing our functional tests later in the course. Now, if I go back to the delegating handler,